My own specialty and publications have focused on the Gospel of Matthew and the Johannine literature. And my favorite approach for exegesis is socio-historical, and my particular interested in interpretation is the history of effects. But because of my origins in Taiwan and my connections with many universities and churches in Asia, I have also developed a second area of research interest in the history and hermeneutics of biblical interpretation in China. In fact, I'm writing a book tentatively entitled Lives of the Bible in China. The purpose is to understand how the Chinese and the Chinese Christians read and interpret the Bible in their special ways, and how the Bible has made impact on the Chinese church and Chinese history. And so those are the two particular areas of my interest. Past summer, the July and August of 2014, I made a trip to Asia, 4 countries, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and Hong Kong. It was a research trip. The reason is this. I was invited by the Reverend Dr. William Sachs, a distinguished church historian and a Kex fellow in World Anglicanism. He is editing a volume for the Oxford History of Anglicanism, and invited me to write an essay called The Anglican Social Ministries in East Asia. And so when I am researching and writing this essay, I realized that yes, in those East Asian countries, the Anglican churches are doing well, even though they are small in number, but they have about 150 years of history now. The English and American missionaries came to those countries in mid-19th century, and they often preached the gospel, but then started a school and a hospital. So from the very beginning, the church, the school, and hospitals are work hand in hand. So if we, in writing this essay, if we can simply bring those wonderful contributions together, there's a lot to be remembered and to be learned. But then I think, well, in the last several decades, the local or indigenous church leaders and churches have taken over those early missionaries' task to preach the gospel, to educate the children, and to heal the sick. But they are also doing many other things in terms of social ministries. So I thought a kind of field trip to interview some of the sites of their social ministries and to interview the bishops and their church leaders would give me insights to what they are doing. And so I planned for this trip, and one of my particular interests is also to find out why they are engaging the traditional social ministry and why they are developing new ministries, what are their biblical visions and what are their theological rationales as they try to meet the needs of the society as a church. Some of the things and people I met to share. The first stop was in Osaka, Japan. I have already visited the Rikyo University and St. Luke's International Hospital in Tokyo before. One was a famous university, and one was one of the finest hospitals in Tokyo as part of the Japan Anglican Church, that is the so-called Nippon Seikokai's social ministries. So I focus on Osaka Diocese, which is the center of the western part of Japan. And my host was the very Reverend Peter Akira Iwaki. Reverend Iwaki is Dean of the Kawaguchi Christ Church, which is the cathedral of the Diocese of Osaka. And he took me to visit 2 places. The first one was a Korean-Japanese center. Now, many people probably are not aware that there are a significant number of Koreans living in Japan for many generations. They were taken there under the Japanese rule to work and serve as laborers, and then they settled down there. But they were never given citizenship. So they are children of the 2-3 generations, born, grown up, and work and married there, do not have citizenship. So they can be expelled at any time. And they are also discriminated in terms of legal, education, and job opportunities. So the Anglican Church, together with a few other Christian denominations, are helping those people out, setting up this community center. And as I visit them, there are a few kind of people resting and gathering there. And I talked to the director, who himself is a Korean Japanese, and I asked him, what is the biblical reason for you to do this? He said, of course, I want to fight for equality for my own people. At the same time, I'm a Christian, and the reason is really theological. He says he's very much inspired by the liberation theology that bring us to Jesus' vision, especially in the Gospel of Luke, for those poor and the marginalized. And therefore, they have this ministry. Now, the second side is what they call the Hakuaisha. Hakuaisha in Japanese means the Society of Broad Love. They have a big campus with a chapel, and then an orphanage, a school, and a elderly nursing facility. And as I talked to the director there, he said that their motto is the Gospel of John chapter 13:34, where Jesus said, as I have loved you, so you must love one another. So their vision is this commitment of love. And so particularly those orphans, the young, and then those very elderly and the lonely. And I must say, when I visit one of their, several of their orphan homes, I couldn't see any happier children in those rooms. And so they obviously are doing a very good job. By the way, I noticed on their chapel, they have a plaque that says that from the very start, that facility received support from the Christian Children's Fund of the Diocese of the Episcopal Diocese of Richmond in USA. So it's amazing that our BTS has some connection there. And then Reverend Iwaki also took me to see the Bishop of Osaka, Bishop Samuel Osamu Onishi. He's a very gracious and gentle person. Growing up as a PK, as a priest kid, he shared with me how he learned to pay attention especially to those who are poor. He wants to find dignity for them. And I think that kind of upbringing in an Anglican priest's family give him that vision. And so when he served as the leader of the church, I noticed that just this most recent national conference of the Nippon Sekokai, Bishop Onishi led a resolution that has been passed by the whole church to call on the Japanese government to create a anti-discrimination law. And so I asked him, why do you want to involve the church to be involved with the politics? He says, well, because in Japan there are several millions of what they call the so-called untouchable people. Many people may not be aware of that. They are Japanese by ethnic background, but their ancestors were engaged in unclean, very low and dirty jobs like leather making and cleaning the dump and so on and so forth. So they were kind of regarded as a very low and dirty social class and shunned. And so as a result, even though their children have become medical doctors or even business people, but they are discriminated often in terms of school or job opportunities. So now the church is asking the government to make law to give them equal rights. So that can kind of remind us of the civil rights movement of the USA. And another interesting thing I learned, an inspiring thing, is that the Japan Sekokai and the Anglican Church of Korea co-host a Anglican-wide peace conference in Okinawa in the summer of 2013, and they come up with a very important study about peacemaking in the world. Because of the presence and the active participation of the Archbishop of Canterbury Welby and the presiding Bishop Shorey, that conference and their resolutions have won the attention of many government leaders. So that reminds me of how the church can do, besides caring for the poor or healing the sick in terms of social ministry. That is to really speak out for the marginalized, the Korean Japanese, or the untouchable, and then speak out the concerns for the world peace. Now, my second place for visit was Korea. I first visited the Anglican University in Seoul. Reverend Dr. Jeremy Young. Jeremy Young was the former president of the Anglican University, and he's also a member of the Anglican Commission on Faith and Unity. He's a well-respected, contextualized theologian. And in my visit to the university, I was impressed to find that they have a master degree program in NGO studies. Turns out that they see the need of that kind of leadership training for NGOs, because in Asia and in many other parts of the world, there are regional conflicts between social classes, the rich and the poor, the industry and the farmers. And there are also many religious fights between the Buddhists, the Hindus, the Muslims, and the Christians, and so on. And so they started this program to train leaders from different religious backgrounds and different social convictions from Asia mostly. And these people returned to their country to become activists and social movement leaders. And so it's again something that was very new to me, because I'm not aware of many universities have a peace program like NGOs trainings. Now, then I had the chance to interview the Archbishop of Korea, the Most Reverend Paul Kim, and his Provincial General Secretary, the Reverend Abraham Kim. One thing interests me, shocking in a way to me, was that very often when we think of social ministry, social service, we think of the ministry of charities and love and mercy. But their social ministry is actually engaging in conflict with the government. And why is that? Because, as we know, Korea is actually facing the threat of North Korea, the South Korea and North Korea. And because of the concern of national security, the military government has not been very democratic. In other words, they could easily put those political dissidents into jail and calling them communists and communist sympathizers. And because they want to develop their industry, and so they often just kick out the poor out of their homeland and take over the land for factories to develop without giving compensation to the poor. And so the church, the Anglican Church of Korea, which is small, they have only about 11 dioceses, but they saw their role as a prophet to speak out against the authorities for the poor. one statistics might be shocking to you as it was to me. That is, 1/3 of their ordained clergy do not have parishes to serve. Their parishes are the poor neighborhoods or the slums. They live in and among those poor people, providing free counseling for legal services, work opportunities, negotiation with employers, and so on and so forth. They help them with their family problems, their children's education, and so on and so forth. And yet they are legitimate, well-qualified priests, 1/3 of them. So you can see how the Korean Anglican Church is doing their work. And from talking to the Archbishop and the General Secretary, it is clear that their social ministry is based on the prophets, the prophetic vision of the Old Testament, that they would speak for God on behalf of the poor against the powerful. So they were not afraid of engaging with the political and social conflict. And for that sake, many of their clergy have been put in jail, but they speak up. So that's why they could also engage in the World Peace Conference, because they see, besides individual salvation and help, those are important. My third place was Taiwan. That's my home country. And on this trip, I visited two particular churches. One is the Good Shepherd Church in Taipei. The rector, the Reverend Li Zhang, is a member of our Dimin program, runs a wonderful church. They have one of the best kindergartens that so many people want to get in. There's a long waiting list to get in. But what I want to call attention to is this award-winning social service program for the elderly. So they have volunteers, they have social workers to care for many of the elderly who live alone, who could not care for themselves day in, day out. Take them to the hospital when necessary and give them food. And they run it so well that the government also gave them financial support to work together. So that's one incredible way of the church as a minority group in a society doing such a good job to win even the government's kind of affirmation. I was also visiting a small church in a poor city called Keelung. This is a wonderful story about a relatively young priest. He's now 10 years into his priesthood, into his ministry. He told me that when he first went to that church, got sent to that church, he has only 8 members in the church. So he was very discouraged. So what can I do? Am I sent here to close down this place by the bishop? Until one day he was sitting outside of his church and see a group of children passing by. This school just finished their school. They're playing with each other, throwing stones at each other, and fighting against each other. He realized, oh, these are all poor children in a very poor neighborhood. Their parents are hard at work, so they don't have any parental care. And as a result, they don't do well in school, and many of them end up being delinquent or become members of the gang. So he prayed about it, and then he decided to break open the wall of his church, literally. So he hired some workers to break open one wall, make it a glass, so the kids can see the tables and the sanctuary and the church, and then he invited them in, give them candies, and help them do their homework, and even provide them dinner so that they can go home without hungry. And you know what? In 3 years' time, his membership rise from 8 to 30 to 40, now 80. And over these last few years, he has helped more than 300 children, and some of them actually now become Christians and come back to work on his social ministry team. And what is amazing is that in these last few years, the same pattern is repeated in another part of the neighborhood. They are also doing well. The church is building up. And he was just starting another church in another part of the country, so I went with him to visit, to witness how he cared for those people. And in the process, he also motivated many young people to join him in that social ministry. So you see, a good social ministry can create a lot of wonderful side effects. Now, my final stop was Hong Kong, the Hong Kong Sengkonghui. This is a small province with only 3 dioceses, about 52 parishes. But you'll be surprised to know, if you don't, that is, they actually run more than 140 schools and more than 400 social service agencies. You will be surprised to see why and how. Well, part of that is history, because Hong Kong used to be a British colony, right? And so the British government and the British Anglican Church has a lot of property and power, and so they kind of hand it over to the Hong Kong Sengkonghui. And so they are doing a good job, and I had the good fortune of talking to Dr. Zheng Yi Li. Dr. Li used to be a professor of political science and a Hong Kong government officials, and then she became the head of this church-run social welfare services Inc. And so they serve not only the poor, the orphans, help to heal the sick. They also, for instance, some new social problems like the immigrant workers, many domestic helpers from Indonesia, from the Philippines, and they all do their very best to help them. And so again, this is an incredible place where I see how they were able to do so many wonderful works. And they have just published a history of their social ministries of 135 years. And this was just published literally in August. And I got my hand on a warm copy. And what I'm most impressed is their theological vision for this kind of wonderful work. The Archbishop Paul Kwan wrote about a new sense of the ministry. He says, well, the church's mission needs to be a 3 horses wagon. The church for the preaching of the gospel, the school for the teaching of all, and then for the social service to support and help all the needy. And he also writes that his biblical vision is based on Matthew 20:28, where Jesus says, for the Son of Man also came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. So as I look through all these 4 areas, I see the commitment to love one another, the commitment to love the marginalized, the commitment to imitate Christ, to love others, is the basic vision for all those social ministries. At the same time, I see how the traditional models of orphanage and schools have now turned into bigger issues of concerns, even political and social structure. And I think there are many things we can learn. And so I'm looking forward to reflect and to digest and try to synthesize more about these experiences. In America and in the West, the Anglican Communion has been troubled by the schism and these debates, and that hurts everybody's hearts. And sometimes we find ourselves very much discouraged. At the same time, the church has so many other missions to do, and all these churches in East Asia, what they are doing in terms of social ministries, warms my heart and inspire me that if we open our heart, mind, and open our eyes to see there's still so many areas of the social life, the poor, the marginalized, the underprivileged, the sufferings, and the threat of war and violence and hatred and conflict among different social groups, among different religious groups, among different racial, ethnic groups, that the church is called also to serve, to make it a better place. And so when I see how those ministries are being done in those countries, I feel hopeful for the future of the communion. Now the second thing is that is related. That is when we begin to see how in some way these younger Anglican Episcopal churches in East Asia than the Church of England or even the Episcopal Church USA, we realize that in some way those who are behind will run ahead of us. In some way we can really learn from what they are doing. Sure, we have done many good social ministries in our own history, in our own countries, but I guess when we learn from each other, we will be able to find even more calling to do that we should follow and do. In teaching ministry, when I have this opportunity to do some research, to visit, to interview, and to reflect, and to write, to analyze, and to compare, I find that that indeed our call to serve the gospel and to serve the church and to serve the world in the name of God, there are many things we can and should do. Sure, there are different history, different culture, and there are different challenges and different needs. But just as some of those churches are doing well in meeting those needs, I think here at VTS, I think each one of us also need to think about what God is calling us to do into the holy orders or into the lay leadership or into any kinds of ministry, that we can be faithful, that we can be innovative, and we can rely on God's grace and spirit to do the right thing. And so a church like this will provide us new models and probably new ways to think along. And I hope this experience can help myself, and through my teaching and perhaps my essays would be helpful to others as well.